Historians of Reddit, what is the biggest fuck you moment in history? French surrender in World War II. Hitler dictates that the French capitulation take place at Compiègne, a forest north of Paris. This is the same spot where 22 years earlier the Germans had signed the armistice ending World War I. Hitler intends to disgrace the French and avenge the German defeat. To further deepen the humiliation, he orders that the signing ceremony take place in the same railroad car that hosted the earlier surrender. The armistice is signed on June 22. Under its terms, 2/3 of France is to be occupied by the Germans. The French army is to be disbanded. In addition, France must bear the cost of the German invasion.
I was hoping someone would post this. Hitler later destroyed the railroad carriage when things started going south for the Axis.
Because, how hilariously shitty would it have been to make them sign the next treaty in the same railroad car?
They'd probably keep it going. And over here, you can see the loser box. This railroad car is kept in storage until a nation gets stomped in warfare, at which point it is prepared for the signing of treaties, a centuries-long tradition.
In the late 1980s, Nintendo and Sony developed a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. Nintendo then pulled out of the partnership and opted to work with Philips instead and released the CDI. This move was highly frowned upon because Nintendo had decided to ditch a fellow Japanese company over a foreign one. So Sony picked up the pieces of the project and tried to partner with Sega. The board of directors turned the idea down, saying,
"That's a stupid idea. Sony doesn't know how to make hardware. They don't know how to make software either. Why would we want to do this?"
At the end, Sony released a game system by the name of PlayStation in 1994 to compete with the Nintendo 64, and outsold their former partners nearly 3-1, plus it marked the first time that Nintendo wasn't top dog since they released the NES. Not the biggest, but definitely one to note. In 1966, Charles de Gaulle ordered all US troops out of France, as he said the country was leaving NATO. Lyndon B. Johnson's first words were to his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk.
"Ask him about the cemeteries, Dean."
When Dean Rusk mentioned whether or not the 60,000 plus US soldiers buried in France were to be removed, de Gaulle simply stood up and left the room, embarrassed.
It really should be noted for context, this is after decades of animosity starting in World War II, with US generals seeing de Gaulle as potentially the next dictator they'd have to fight. Highlights include threatening to join the Russian sphere if Vietnam were granted independence. Oh boy. That ended well. Julius Caesar's death. At least he died surrounded by friends.
The first recorded incident of a group project where most of the group doesn't do the work.
I love it, because there are several levels. There were about 40 conspirators. Caesar received 23 stab wounds. So right off the bat, and not even accounting for people managing to stab him multiple times, about half the folks involved did jack shit. But then later his body was examined, and the doctor concluded that only one of those was properly fatal on its own. Even of the people that actually did any work at all, just one got it right, and didn't half-ass things. That's a group project.
A pirate known as Jean Leffitt had a bounty of $500 put on him by a governor. So, he put a $5,000 bounty on the governor.
No, you.
Guy used the Uno reverse card before it was cool.
I was about to say that. Maybe it was cool back then though.
That's not even Jean Lafitte's best you moment in my opinion. He was propositioned by the British, basically.
Hey. Show us how to navigate the swamps around New Orleans, so we can launch a sneak attack. And the king will pardon you, and make you a privateer.
And he was like, "Give me a fortnight to consider it." So he snuck over to the governor's mansion, scaled the outside wall, and was waiting for him on his office. Told the governor, and Andrew Jackson the British plan, and offer, and how he wouldn't betray New Orleans, because he loved her. So all he asked was for a pardon, and he'd give them everything they needed to win the war. And he did. The British, eh?
So when France exiles Napoleon Bonaparte, the first time, they didn't think to change out military personnel. So he basically rolls up to the first French outpost he gets to, says, "Sup," and begins reassembling an army. By the time he gets to Paris, he's got enough forces that France is like, well, welcome back.
That is amazing. I will admit that my French history is just awful, but I was curious, how do the French treat the history of Napoleon? Is it like how the Russians treat Stalin and Lenin, how Americans treat someone like Washington, or say Teddy Roosevelt, or is it somewhere in between?
He's treated as a great emperor and leader. We're told about the occupation of French, and all the deaths, but in the end, he's celebrated.
In the 1970s, the small town of Vulcan, West Virginia, asked for state funding to replace a bridge into town. The state legislature refused to grant Vulcan the funding they needed. Instead, the town appealed to the Soviet Union for aid. After hearing about the request, the state legislature immediately granted over $1 million for the town to build a new bridge. If a small town in West Virginia asking for Soviet funding in the middle of the Cold War isn't a big middle finger to the state government, then I don't know what is.
The funny part is that 2 Soviet representatives at the US Embassy actually came over to look at the broken bridge, and seriously considered funding the rebuilding to piss off the Americans.
Imagine the propaganda the Soviets could have pushed from that.
Honestly, smart move by the town. Win for them. No matter who funds it.
This is already one of my favorite threads in Reddit history. Galbartino, Chilean warrior, who had both his hands cut off by the conquistadors, for raising arms against the Spanish. Instead of letting himself serve as a message of helplessness, in the face of the invaders, the crazy bastard strapped swords to his stumps, and went on the warpath. May I add that when he got defeated again, the Spanish were impressed, and offered him to surrender, but he spit in the commander's face, so they literally fed him to their dogs. On the crowning of King Henry VII, he backdated his own reign to before the date of the Battle of Bosworth, meaning anyone who was loyal to him now, but had shown any sign of opposition at Bosworth was now a traitor, and an enemy to the realm. Justice served.
That sounds like the premise behind the Blackadder.
Oh, my god. I've killed Uncle Dickie.
When Germanic tribes invaded Britain after the Romans left, they named the native Celts, Wellisk, meaning foreigner. Even though they themselves were the foreigners. That later became the word Welsh, which the English promptly adopted for phrases like
Welch on a bet.
Long story short, all of history has been one giant etymological middle finger to the Welsh.
Yeah, but the Welsh language is itself a middle finger to English speakers.
More like the English orthography used for Welsh is a middle finger to the Welsh people. The Irish language as written has similar issues as well. A bunch of phonemes, and sounds that don't exist in English, are instead written using weird letter combos, and really subtle grammar tricks. I sometimes think it was a deliberate tactic to make sure nobody could bloody read either Welsh or Irish.
The reply of the Zaporozhian Cossacks is the best response to a demand for surrender ever. In response to requests by the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire to desist attacks and submit.
Zaporozhian Cossacks to the Turkish Sultan. O Sultan, Turkish devil, and damned devil's kith and kin, secretary to Lucifer himself. What the devil kind of knight are thou, that canst not slay a hedgehog with your naked ass? The devil shit, and your army eats. Thou shalt not, thou son of a whore, make subjects of Christian sons. We have no fear of your army, by land, and by sea we will battle with thee, fuck thy mother. Thou Babylonian scullion, Macedonian wheelwright, brewer of Jerusalem, goat fucker of Alexandria, swineherd of Greater and Lesser Egypt, pig of Armenia, Podolian thief, catamite of Tartary, hangman of Kamianets, and fool of all the world, and underworld, an idiot before God, grandson of the serpent, and the crick in our dick. Pig's snout, mare's ass, slaughterhouse cur, unchristened brow, screw thine own mother. So the Zaporozhians declare, you lowlife. You won't even be herding pigs for the Christians? Now we'll conclude, for we don't know the date, and don't own a calendar, the moon's in the sky, the year with the Lord, the day's the same over here as it is over there, for this kiss our ass. Koshuvi Ottoman Ivan Sirko, with the whole Zaporozhian host.
Edit, 7 years in, and my first gold. Neat.
There's a painting of this moment, with all the Cossacks laughing, as they compose the letter.
I'll never get tired of that painting. You can hear them just looking at it. Also, Ilya Rapin's an amazing painter in general, and the rest of his stuff's always worth a look.
It's a great depiction, and you can really imagine the arguments going back and forth over which insults to put in next.
Tell him to f his mother.
We already did that.
Tell him again.
Can we just agree that whoever put
and the crick in our dick
is a god damn legend?
My personal favorite, the beginning of the Battle of Stamford Bridge in England, 1066. England's been invaded by a Norwegian army led by Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, and Tostig Godwinson, exiled English earl, and estranged brother to the English king. They've already fought one battle, they've captured York. Things are looking good for them. They're chilling, enjoying their success, waiting at Stamford Bridge for the hostages they demanded. It's a hot day. They're not expecting any trouble, but wait, an English army shows up. That's practically impossible. The Battle of Fulford Gate had taken place only 5 days ago, and the Norwegians had completely routed the forces of the Northern Earls. The rest of the English army was known to be in the south, awaiting a Norman invasion. Turns out, the English had ridden all the way up north in 4 days. The Norwegians were, understandably, a bit unhappy. They form into a circle. They don't have their armor with them, it's at the ships. It's too hot to be hanging around in mail. They've got helmets, and shields, and weaponry, and that's it. The English send a rider to negotiate. He tells Tostig that his brother the king is willing to offer him his earldom back, and part of the rule of England if he gives up now. Tostig asks what his buddy Harald Hardrada gets for his trouble. 6 feet of English ground, or as much more as he needs, being taller than other men. Tostig says they're done here. The rider rides away. Harald Hardrada asks who that dude was, because if it had been him talking, he'd have just killed the bastard there. Tostig says, "Oh, that's my brother. That's Harold Godwinson, the king." Harold Godwinson rode up to an enemy army personally, and told the King of Norway, known to be a great warrior and general, that all he'd get from this invasion was a grave. Battle commences. Norwegians lose. Tostig and Harald Hardrada both die. Huge bloody mess. English army is crippled. And then 3 days later the Normans land in the south. Harold is He still marches his army back, gathers as much force as he can, and engages 3 weeks later. He's killed at Hastings. Normans conquer England. Basically, a very personal moment that snowballed quite intensely. Edit, because a lot of people are asking. Yes, this was the battle with the legendary berserker at the bridge. No, it probably didn't actually happen. The story appears hundreds of years later, and is very inconsistent. Also, there might not have been an actual bridge there at the time.
That whole period of English history was just one f*** after another. There's a good 3, I think, part series on Amazon Prime if anyone is interested. Just called 1066 if I remember correctly. Edit, full title of the show is 1066, A Year to Conquer England.
The time period is fascinating to study. The issue is that everyone just pays attention to William of Normandy, and he really just kinda got lucky with his invasion timing.
Ferruccio Lamborghini was a rich man, owning his company that built tractors. He talked to Ferrari about the imperfections of his car, and how to improve them, and they basically laughed at a young tractor mechanic trying to tell them about sport cars. So he decided to start making luxury sports cars, to compete with Ferrari, and thus, the rivalry was born. So, I'd say the middle finger of this guy to Ferrari was pretty noticeable.
Every time I read this story, I wish Lamborghini had its own Formula One team to beat Ferrari, since that was Enzo Ferrari's true pride and joy.
Lamborghini didn't want to race though. That's his original complaint to Ferrari in the first place. The car was just too hard for road use, and its clutch looked like a race car. So he started a pretty successful sports car brand for the road, not for the track.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out my other videos. Also, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and ring the notification bell.